Ben Hodges is a retired Lieutenant General of the U.S. Army Europe. He was a commanding officer at the U.S. Army Europe. Welcome to the program, General Hodges.
Thank you very much for the privilege.
Ukrainian army continues its offensive operation inside Russia. There have been many advances inside the Kursk region. Institute of Study of War reported even about the 35 kilometers advance of Ukraine deep inside the Kursk region. What did impress you the most in this offensive or incursion of Ukraine inside the Kursk region?
Three things have really impressed me about this. Number one, once again, we have underestimated Ukrainian capabilities for planning, for secrecy, for combined arms, for using all of their capabilities to great effect. We have underestimated that, and we have overestimated Russia's ability to conduct operations in response to it. Now, clearly, Ukraine caught Russia by surprise, just as many in the West were caught by surprise with the size and competence of this operation. That's the first thing. The second thing is that we don't know exactly what the specific objectives are for the Ukrainian government and for the general staff. And we're not entitled to know. I should not know. So what I'm going to say next is only my speculation based on what I see and what I think. But it seems to me that this counteroffensive by the Ukrainians is intended to clear out a large area in the Kursk Oblast in order to deny it as sanctuary for Russian artillery, Russian rocket launchers, Russian efforts to prepare for future operations against Ukraine. So the Ukrainians are denying this area, what I've seen referred to as a Kursk bridgehead, which I think is the right approach. It also is changing the momentum, the conversation, the narrative about what's going on. You don't hear people talking about the inevitability that Russia is going to win. And I suspect that Ukraine actually has a lot more troops and capabilities involved in this than is evident to all of us. Now, I think one of the intended outcomes of this counteroffensive is also to try and relieve some pressure on Ukrainian forces that are in the east, defending Pokrovsk, for example. Although I think we in the West are probably more focused and worried about this than Ukrainian general staff is actually worried about it. The third big impression I have from what I have seen so far is about the Russian response, how inept, slow, and chaotic it has, and ineffective it has been. It has. Putin put the FSB in charge of the response because it's embarrassing for him, obviously, and so he needs to frame this as a terrorist operation by the Ukrainians. So therefore, he puts the FSB in charge of the response. But obviously, FSB, this is not their core competency. They've demonstrated for the last 2.5 years that this is not what they do. And there is no love lost between the general staff and the FSB and the Rosguardia and other elements inside of Russia. And so the general staff is not going to do anything to help FSB be successful in their response. So I think the ineffective command and control and the hatred and rivalries inside of Russia between the different forces is contributing to a very poor response.
Also, it seems like Russian commanders do not want to move its most experienced units from the east of Ukraine to the Kursk region. Do you see this tactics as a wise one, and how could it end this decision-making process, their unwillingness to move its most experienced troops from the war zone on the east of Ukraine to the Kursk region?
Well, I think there's a couple of reasons why this has not happened yet. Number one, I just described what I think is a very confused and ineffective command and control structure inside of Russia between the FSB, which is going to run the response to Kursk, to the Ukrainian counteroffensive in the direction of Kursk, and the general staff, which is running operations in the east. The general staff, the Russian general staff, has no real interest in seeing the FSB be successful. So they're not in a hurry to start moving troops away from the direction of Pokrovsk to Kursk. So eventually, at some point, somebody will have to have the authority to make the decision to cause that to happen. I don't think that person has been clearly identified or has made the decision yet that they have to respond. The second thing is the logistics required to move people of any meaningful size over that distance. It's doubtful that there are a lot of trucks or trains standing by ready to start moving people. I mean, you would have to start the clock on that sort of preparation from the time that somebody says, okay, I need to move a brigade or two brigades from here to there. So logistically is a challenge. And then the distances, it's about over 500 kilometers, let's call it 550 kilometers. If you were to drive a vehicle direct from Pokrovsk to, what is the name of the city, from Zhuja, it's about 550 kilometers. But that's a direct drive through Ukrainian territory over Kharkiv. So that's obviously not a route that Russian forces could take. They would have to go around Ukrainian-controlled areas. And so it's probably closer to 700, 800, 900 kilometers. That's a long time. And that's assuming that they have the hundreds of trucks just standing by ready to start moving people, or the hundreds of rail cars that would be needed. So I doubt that the capabilities are in place yet to move troops, equipment, ammunition necessary to have an effective response.
Also, Medusa reported that Russia would like to use conscripts to try to repel Ukraine's offensive inside Russia. What is your reaction to this?
Well, it shows the desperation on the Russian side, and the political problem for Putin is growing. You know, they have avoided mobilizing people from Moscow and St. Petersburg because they don't want them to feel the effects of this war. And so they already have manpower problems as is, with hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of Russian men and women having left the country over the last few years. There are manpower shortages in their industry already. So I think that they are going to have to start making some very, very hard decisions inside Russia about dealing with manpower shortages. Russia does not have endless amounts of people, and certainly they may finally get to the point that the sons of oligarchs and senior officers and government officials might actually have to get involved.
Do you expect Russia to launch another mobilization campaign this year? Bloomberg reported that it could be a possibility for the Russian government.
Yeah, it is a possibility, but that's what I mean. This is a big political decision for the Kremlin, and I think that they would prefer to find other proxies, like more Chechens, for example. I think that's why Volodymyr Putin was recently in Chechnya and other places trying to find more bodies so that he doesn't have to make that hard political decision that you're talking about.
Also, Ukraine has successfully destroyed 3 Russia's key bridges in the Kursk region. Military experts suggest that it could mean there is a potential for the encirclement of Russian troops there. Do you feel that Russians are slowly losing this battle of Kursk?
Well, it certainly, unless the Russians are able to mount an effective response, which they have not done so far, that they will have a difficult time of eliminating this Kursk bridgehead that the Ukrainian Armed Forces have established. And the destruction of those bridges tells me that that shows you one of the limits, perhaps, of how far Ukraine wants to go. And the Russians, who used to be, back during the time of the Soviet Union, they were famous for having excellent river crossing capabilities. I don't think they have that same sort of competence anymore. They certainly have not demonstrated it over the last couple of years. And so their ability to repair bridges or to build military bridging quickly, I think I'm skeptical of that. And certainly when they do try, the Ukrainians will figure out a way to destroy those as well.
From your perspective, what are the chances for the Ukrainian Armed Forces to move forward and to put Kursk under pressure, to threaten Kursk with artillery fire? How far could Ukrainian troops go from a military point of view and from your personal opinion?
Well, right now, I think they can go as far as they want. And I think that they probably have anticipated the logistical requirements, the Russian responses, and because we don't know, I don't know exactly what the Ukrainian General Staff's objectives are. I can't really accurately forecast how much further they'll go. One of the advantages of this bridgehead that they have created is that they can move the Ukrainians can move their rocket launchers further inside Russia. So even though the United States and UK and Germany have put restrictions on use of some weapon systems inside of Russia, now Ukraine can move its own rocket launchers and drones deeper into Russia in order to attack more Russian airfields, more Russian energy infrastructure, which I think are important improvements in Ukrainian capabilities. I think also they now are threatening the they are threatening the Russian nuclear power plant in Kursk. This creates a real dilemma for Russia and what they're doing around Zaporizhzhia. So I imagine that's part of the consideration, and the capture of the Russian gas hub at Zhuhai also is an important leverage for the Ukrainian side on whether or not they divert the gas or they destroy it or do something else. All of these are benefits of what Ukraine has done thus far.
Wall Street Journal also reported that Ukraine's strikes on those bridges in the Kursk region could be a sign of Ukraine's intention to hold this newly controlled terrain in the Kursk region for a while. What would it take for Ukraine to do that, and what is your reaction to this?
Well, I think that's a reasonable conclusion that the Wall Street Journal has drawn. It certainly, destroying those bridges not only limits Russia's ability, or degrades Russia's ability to respond, but it also helps lead to the encirclement of Russian forces there, to which you have already alluded. But I don't think this operation is happening by itself. I think that that Ukrainian General Staff has other things in mind, either in another direction or further. We just don't know this, but I am confident that the General Staff would have taken into account what they would need for engineering capability to protect the shoulders, if you will, of what they have captured thus far, the necessary ammunition, fuel, other logistical considerations. I suspect they are capturing a lot from the Russians that are there. But I think the General Staff and the GUR are so clever. They understand the Russians better than any of us in the West will ever understand the Russians. And I would not think this is the only thing that's going to be happening.
You mentioned about the understanding of the Russian side. Recently, U.S. military intelligence has come to a conclusion that the war in Ukraine becomes a stalemate for both sides. This conclusion has been prepared before Ukraine's incursion inside the Russian territory. Why was Pentagon so wrong about Ukraine's capabilities and Ukraine's ability to conduct surprise attack inside Russia?
Well, I don't know that everybody in the Pentagon was so wrong, but unfortunately, the administration has generally underestimated Ukrainian capabilities and overestimated Russian capabilities. And there are, unfortunately, in Washington, in London, in Berlin, and in other capitals in the West, still too many people who just can't believe that Russia can be defeated, who are willing to accept Russian talking points about Ukrainian shortcomings. And so, all of these things have contributed to our underestimation of Ukraine and overestimation of Russia. Good thing that Ukraine does not listen to us.
Also, The Economist reported that Ukraine's objective in the Kursk region could be to obtain a bargaining chip for negotiations with Russia. Do you feel that this offensive and this current territorial gains of Ukraine put enough pressure on Russia to force Moscow to appropriate and acceptable for Ukraine peaceful settlement of this war?
Well, certainly that could be one of the reasons for what they're doing. That's a reasonable analysis, but I think so many observers from all of these different experts that you are citing, we're all speculating about what we think this is for, what can happen, what are some of the outcomes. These are not unreasonable. I don't know that that's the objective of the government or the general staff. Perhaps it is. But this does create a lot of problems for the Kremlin. What did they do about the hundreds, maybe thousands of troops who have been captured, including lots of Chechens who have been captured? The impact on Russia's oil and gas infrastructure and now threatening their nuclear power infrastructure in the Kursk Oblast. Their inability or the infighting inside Russia between FSB, General Staff, Rosguardia. I think Russia is in a very bad spot right now, and now is the time where we should be putting additional pressure on them, helping Ukraine, and certainly I'm happy that the U.S. government has not been telling Ukraine, hey, be careful, slow down. I regret that we still have restrictions on what Ukraine can do with ATACMS, but at least we're not seeing or hearing as much warnings from Mr. Sullivan, for example, to Ukraine about, hey, take it easy.
Let's cover also Russian President Putin and his elites. What do Vladimir Putin and his people around him think about this situation? What do they feel right now from your perspective?
So, of course, I don't know. I can't possibly know exactly what's going on inside the minds of Putin and the people around him. It's interesting that every time there is a huge problem or a crisis in Russia, Putin manages to put a lot of distance between himself and what's happening so that he's not personally associated with the disaster. The fact that he's in Azerbaijan and in Chechnya here the last several days while this is happening is the latest example of this. Now, perhaps he doesn't really know what's happening. Perhaps, as often happens in a very dictatorial, centralized government or command and control system, people are reluctant to tell the great leader exactly what's happening. That could be the case here. I don't know. I have never been able to fully understand the Russian population, but I don't have any confidence that the Russian people will rise up the way that Ukrainian people did during the time of Maidan. I don't see that happening in Russia. I think the internal security forces are too strong, and most people who criticize the government end up dead or in jail. And oligarchs who do not deliver or show adequate loyalty end up dead as well. So it's hard for me to gauge accurately what's going on inside Russia. I suspect that Ukrainian government, Ukrainian general staff has a much better feel for that than I would.
I would like also to ask you about the communication between Ukraine and the West. The Economist reported that the West was not informed about this operation by Ukraine because there were two incidents in the previous time. Two previous operations were undermined by the West. There was one operation was leaked to the Russian side, another Ukraine was warned against. Another operation. What is your take on this? Do you feel that there is enough safety in these communication lines between Ukraine and the United States?
I think the government in Kyiv is correct and wise to be very, very careful about what information they share with anybody. That would be normal. I think that probably there is still trust and cooperation in certain channels, intelligence sharing, for example. I'm confident that the U.S. and U.K. and some others are providing helpful intelligence to Ukraine. I would hope so. But, one of the common practices is to, even with your closest allies, and when we do it inside the United States, everybody doesn't know everything. You compartmentalize based on who needs to know certain things. So to me, it would be a correct thing for Ukraine to be very, very careful about compartmentalization of information associated with this operation.
I would like also to quote one official of the Biden administration. Ukraine does not need to use British Storm Shadow missiles inside Russian territory because homemade drones can do more damage to Russian forces, the Biden administration official told The Telegraph. Why do they think so?
Well, why would anybody think that person knows anything about military operations? I mean, that's the kind of thinking and statement that is not only unhelpful, it's also foolish. We should not be telling Ukraine how to use what sort of weapons. But this reflects this continuing failure inside our government by many people to understand what's required to help Ukraine win the war. Instead of telling them use this instead of this, we should shut up, get out of the way, and give Ukraine what's needed to win.
Also, let's cover U.S. administration politics regarding Ukraine. Do you feel that those people and officials who feared about escalation, nuclear escalation, has finally understood that they were wrong?
I doubt it. Clearly, we have been wrong. It's been very frustrating for me for the last couple of years that at the self-deterrence by the U.S. government, that our continued excessive fear that Russia might use a nuclear weapon has prevented us from doing what needed to be done. Hopefully, some people are finally realizing that this has been wrong, but I think there still are too many people out there who cannot accept that they have been so wrong. I've only got like 2 more minutes, okay?
Yeah, and my last question for you, if there is more movement of Ukraine deep inside the Kursk region, how could it influence the Western philosophy on providing Ukraine with long-range missiles, drones? Do you feel that it could lead to permission for Ukraine to strike deep inside Russia with long-range cruise missiles and ATACMS missiles?
I don't know that, of course, but I certainly hope so. This is part of Ukraine defending itself against Russian air attacks and drones and glide bombs, being able to destroy Russian airfields from which those attacks have been launched, and also helping Ukraine to destroy Russia's oil and gas infrastructure, which generates the money necessary for Russia to stay in the war. I think, we should recognize that it is in the interest of the West that Ukraine is successful and defeats Russia, and we should give Ukraine everything it needs without restriction in order to help defeat Russia.
Thank you, General HODGES, for your time and for your support for Ukraine. Glory to Ukraine.
Thank you very much for this privilege. Slava Ukraini.
Героям слава. Thank you, General Hodges. Ryan McBeth is a U.S. Army veteran. He is also open intelligence sources analyst or SINT analyst. Welcome to the program, Ryan.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here.
I would like to start with Ukraine's offensive inside Russia. With this development, there are lots of discussions on this issue in Ukraine, and I believe in the United States too. What is your take on this development, and what do Americans think about this?
I can tell you that the development was pretty darn surprising. It seems to me that Ukraine is attacking where the landmines are not, meaning since most of the south and east has so many landmines, so many defenses, Ukraine made a conscious decision to essentially go around them and cause damage to the adversary by going around them and attacking weaker points. The one thing that I've noticed in the United States, at least among the military community, is people who were former Stryker infantry. Stryker is that 8-wheeled armored personnel carrier that was donated to Ukraine. People who are in the American Army who are former Stryker infantry are as happy as, are extremely happy right now, because the Stryker is actually being used for what it was intended to be used for, and that was exploit a breakthrough and wreak havoc among the enemy's rear lines. So it seems like the mood here in the U.S. is pretty good, especially if you're former Stryker infantry.
What is your take on this U.S.-made equipment which is used for Ukraine's offensive inside Russia? What are its chances against Russia's equipment there in the Kursk region?
So usually it's the better crewmen. Right? It's not necessarily the better piece of equipment. The better piece of equipment helps. Usually it's the more highly motivated, the better trained crewman that tends to win the fight, although luck also plays a role. One advantage of a lot of Western equipment is that it is more survivable, meaning that if that vehicle gets hit with an enemy round, there's a better chance of the crew living to fight another day, or even having that vehicle repaired. So that's kind of the deal there. It's not just the equipment. Equipment is great. It is equipment combined with the fighting spirit of the Ukrainian soldier that makes this equipment so good.
From your perspective, what would Ukraine need now from the United States in terms of security assistance, especially for offensive purposes?
They would probably need, obviously, more anti-tank missiles, more Strykers. They've already shown they can use these things really well. And if the United States could reduce any kind of prohibition on exporting F-16s, we have plenty of F-16s sitting in the boneyard in, I believe it's Arizona, which is this, Arizona or Nevada, essentially sitting in the American desert. We can repair these F-16s, we can get them over to Ukraine, and we can give them more than just the F-16s that have been promised by the Danish governments and the Netherlands. We've already proven, Ukraine has proven they can use this weapon platform. Getting more F-16s over to Ukraine would be essential to allowing them to finish the fight.
I would like also to cover U.S. administration reaction towards this offensive inside Russia. It seems like there are not any kind of objections. What is your personal opinion on this?
Do you mean objections in America on the offensive, or objections from Russia?
Yeah.
Because it seems like you don't see a lot coming out of Russia either.
Sure, yeah, I'm talking especially about the U.S. administration.
You know, America loves a winner. America loves a winner. And I think that one of the things that Americans understand is they understand audacity. Audacity being the desire to do something that's so bold that it just shocks your enemy. And I think that most Americans see that and they go, wow, they are fighting back. And there is a culture in this country that goes all the way back to 1776 when America fought the British. And it's one of the reasons so many Americans have guns. We all believe that one day, if we have to, we're going to cast away tyranny. And so that plays in the mindset of the average American, this idea of fighting tyranny. And I think they see Ukraine doing that. And it would almost be like the United States invading England back in 1776 and taking the fight to the enemy. So we see that, and I think most Americans are appreciative of Ukraine's audacity.
I would like also to cover escalation fears. Do you feel that the United States has been played by Russia on this escalation threats, nuclear threats? Vladimir Putin has not used nuclear weapons despite the fact that Ukraine invaded Russia.
So escalation is it's a very loaded term, mainly because Russia doesn't need an excuse to escalate. They just kind of do that naturally. It's not like they're going to go, wow, we need to bomb Ukraine harder. They're already doing that. So escalation is mainly used as a way to discourage the West from sending aid or supporting Ukraine. And the fact is that nuclear weapons really aren't that useful on the battlefield, at least in the current operational conditions. A nuclear weapon would be a useful way of destroying an amphibious ready group or an aircraft carrier. Ukraine doesn't really have a navy. Amphibious or nuclear weapons would be good for striking deep underground bunkers. Ukraine really doesn't have any of those command and control centers like America has with NORAD or like Taiwan has. Now, nuclear weapons could be used to stop an advance or halt a breakthrough, but one of the issues is that Ukraine is moving so darn fast that they would be able to go around that particular nuclear weapon or that particular crater. And also, if you could use a nuclear weapon to counterattack and detonate one of your enemy lines and rush your forces through, but with what forces is Russia doing this? So you can talk about escalation all you want, but from a practical level, a nuclear weapon really wouldn't be all that useful. And you also have to take a look at China. I would not be surprised if China has said to Russia, do not use a nuclear weapon, because the second you do that, it's going to be a lot easier for America to use a nuclear weapon on Chinese forces if they invade Taiwan. And that is a use case, destroying an amphibious ready group, destroying aircraft carriers, destroying ships. China does not want Pandora's nuclear box opened in Ukraine because they do not want nuclear weapons used in Russia. They do not want nuclear weapons used against them in Taiwan.
From your perspective, why did Biden administration even buy this Putin's threats and his bluff, his nuclear bluff, and why did Americans buy this nuclear bluff?
Well, there are a lot of people who make money through selling fear. And most Americans don't understand the use cases for nuclear weapons, or when they think of a nuclear weapon, they think of movies where entire cities are getting destroyed. And it's a very easy path to say, what if Russia goes nuclear? Because most people don't ask the next question, which is, well, what does that look like? Right? And I could see Russia using a nuclear weapon somewhere in the Donbass to cause an explosion and then break through that one area where people were defending. But how can Russia do that when they don't have enough troops to actually exploit the breakthrough? So they're going to throw away their nuclear card on an operation which they can't sustain. Now, I know that, but the average person doesn't know. And there is money to be made from scaring people and saying, what if Russia uses a nuclear weapon, without answering the second question of why and how.
But who is making money on this?
Well, this would be a lot of online influencers or people who write articles. people who are edgelords that support Russia because it's kind of edgy to do that. They get these fake internet points, and the fact is that people on Twitter or people on YouTube, they make money. They sell eyeballs,
like
right? They
clickbait,
sell ads against fear mongering. And you see this on, there was a TV show called Breaking Points, which is an alternative news publication, which I've gone after before for publishing fake news. They do this all the time, where they talk about Russia and nuclear weapons as if they know what they're talking about. And you know what? When you say nuclear, that kind of triggers that fear in someone's brain, and they want to watch and find out what could happen because of some morbid curiosity.
But after Ukraine's offensive inside Russia, do you feel that this fear of escalation is still alive in the United States and in other Western countries?
I don't know about other Western countries, but I know in the United States, I think we all took a look at it and we went, you know what? Nothing happened. Yeah, we sent HIMARS to Ukraine. There was no nuclear war. We sent ATACMS to Ukraine. There was no nuclear war. We sent F-16. Well, we didn't send F-16s. We approved the transfer of F-16s. There was no nuclear war. Ukraine invaded Russian soil for the first time in 70 years. This is the first time Ukraine has invaded anybody, right?
Sure, yeah.
And there was no nuclear war. I think that the whole nuclear war thing might just be a card that is played by Russia when they want to get their way, and they have no intention of using nuclear weapons because, number one, China doesn't want them to, and number two, the second they use a nuclear weapon, they have to back that up in some way, and they just don't have the troops to exploit the kind of operations that a nuclear weapon would allow them to exploit.
How do you see Russia's reaction to Ukraine's offensive inside Russia? It seems like there were pretty much chaos and disorganization there. And from your perspective, how do you see Vladimir Putin right now? What could he think about?
Well, I think what they might be thinking is that they might be viewing this particular incursion as not that big of a deal. Russia's pretty big, and I believe Ukraine has maybe captured the amount of territory equivalent to the American state of Rhode Island. Not that much territory. So I believe what Russia is doing is that they're displaying a level of discipline to an extent where they're not going to let this particular incursion take their focus off the South, because I believe Russia goes, you know what? There's not a lot of damage they can do in the big scheme of things. Yeah, they might be able to cut a rail line, but we have another rail line that can help that. I think it was, I can't remember the darn name of the town, but there's two rail lines that go down to this one particular town. I want to say it was Berdansk, but I might be incorrect about that. So there's two rail lines that go down to this one particular town. Ukraine was able to cut one of them. That puts a lot of pressure on a second rail line, but it's not the end of the world. Russia can still supply their troops there. So I think Russia might be looking at this from the standpoint of, you never want your adversary to dictate to you what you should do. You should be having your adversary react to what you're doing. And I think if Russia actually responds to this, then they might be falling into whatever trap the Ukrainians have set, because a lot of people have looked at this particular incursion and they've gone, well, we don't know what Ukraine is doing. Are they going after an objective? Is it the city of Kursk? Is it the nuclear power plant? Or is it rail lines? What are they doing there? And what Ukraine might be doing is they might be performing what's called a feint, meaning they're attacking in one place, and then once Russia responds, they're going to attack another place. And so what Russia might be doing is just not responding because they're waiting for that second attack to happen. So that's kind of number one. And the second possibility is that Ukraine might have done this to force a general mobilization. Back in 2022, there was this deal between the Russian people and President Putin, at least the Russian people who lived in St. Petersburg and in Moscow. Do whatever you want, but don't take our kids. And that's why the war, the initial invasion of Ukraine was fought with kontraktniki, right? So when Russia had a general mobilization in, I think it was September of 2022, the people in the elites in St. Petersburg and Moscow went, whoa, you're taking our kids. And that's when you saw Wagner. That's when you saw the amount of money being released for volunteers, for prisoners to get out of prison and fight. You saw that amount of money go up. And what this could be is a way for Ukraine to force a general mobilization. So if Russia doesn't respond to the incursion, then hopefully it kind of peters out if Ukraine can't sustain those logistical lines. And then they don't have to respond by increasing the size of the army, which would require conscription, which would make everybody in St. Petersburg and Moscow mad, which could trigger a coup against Putin.
And I would like also to cover, you said about coup against Vladimir Putin. Do you feel that he's so afraid of this full-scale mobilization that he would not do that? Because Bloomberg reported that Russia could conduct another mobilization until the end of this year. However, there are concerns that Russian people would not like this decision. Do you feel that Putin does not have an exit from this situation?
That's a very good question. I'm not sure there is a good response here. You know, in business, one of the options is always to do nothing. And if Ukraine is expecting Russia to do something and Russia doesn't fall into that trap, then it actually makes sense to do nothing and allow Ukraine to keep this territory. Now it's their problem to defend, right? So I think that almost by responding to this, it could place President Putin into a worse position. So the idea is just don't respond to it or contain it with a minimum number of troops. And yeah, there is enough Russian control of the media that they might be able to spin this narrative. But as of right now, by not responding to it, President Putin actually puts himself in a better situation than he would by responding to it.
It seems like also there are some critical statements even on Russia's state media regarding Vladimir Putin's war effort and his strategy on Ukraine. Is there a chance that this criticism could rise and would be really strong towards Putin? This criticism could lead even to the regime change from your perspective.
That's more of a geopolitical question. I tend to do better with specific weapons. But in a case like this, I don't know if being embarrassed would necessarily put President Putin in a situation like that. He was embarrassed when Wagner did their 200-mile convoy, to Moscow that eventually turned around. It seems like he is able to survive embarrassment. He is able to survive minor criticism. But what he wouldn't be able to survive is a general mobilization that took kids from the wealthy to go and fight. That might be a little beyond the pale, and he would lose a lot of support. But I think he can survive a little bit of criticism, people saying he isn't fighting hard enough.
But if Ukraine moves forward and moves forward into the even more deep into the Russian territory in the Kursk region, can he really survive such blow to his reputation and the reputation of his military?
That's a very good question. If Ukraine captures a major city like Kursk proper, or they capture a nuclear power plant, I believe that power plant supplies 50% of the electricity to Ukraine's steel industry. I might be incorrect about that. I'm trying to do this from memory. That might be a little bit harder to get away from if all of a sudden your people are in the dark and you can't actually build tanks anymore because you don't have enough steel production. That could be an issue. Capturing Kursk proper, the actual city, might be a little too far. And one of the things Russia might not want to see is an actual battle in Kursk, which destroys buildings and leaves a significant population homeless. You talk about the chickens coming home to roost. Russia did that plenty in Ukraine. They might not necessarily want to see that on their soil. So if Ukraine gets as far as Kursk proper or the nuclear power plant, I could see that becoming an issue, but Russia might find enough forces to strike back before that actually happens.
Also, The Economist reported that Ukraine has not informed the United States about this offensive inside Russia because two previous operations which have been prepared by Ukraine were undermined after Ukraine informed the United States about the details of those two operations. First operation Ukraine has been warned against the first operation, and second operation was leaked to the Russian side. Do you feel that there could be some problems with security of information in this communication between Ukraine and the United States?
Well, there always is. And anytime you put out some sort of signal, you stand a chance of that signal being intercepted. And you also stand the chance of cowards in the American administration leaking this to people because they might not want Ukraine to necessarily win. They might want Ukraine to stay in a stalemate with Russia, at least until after the election. Americans hate surprises between September and October of election years. So I could easily see someone in the current administration leaking information like this. Hey, there's going to be a big attack, just because they don't want any surprises. But one of the things that Ukraine is really good at, I am so surprised. Their operational security, they were able to keep this operation secret to an absurd degree. I had never seen anything like this before. I believe 2 brigades of troops, I believe they hid them in Sumy, essentially under parking garages, and then sent them to the front lines. What they did was incredible. I think this particular operation is going to be studied at military schools like West Point and Sandhurst for the next 50 years. It was really that good, and that level of operational security was incredible.
Why haven't we seen any kind of resistance from Russian people in Kursk region towards to Ukraine's offensive inside Russia? It's an interesting question, isn't it?
It is an interesting question, and I know that Russia does have civilian ownership of firearms. You are allowed to own a gun if you're a citizen, but the only thing I can think of is that it could be that all the military-aged men who would act as a resistance, they might already be drafted. And that doesn't mean that women can't fight. Women can certainly fight as partisans, but they haven't chosen to do so. And so I can think of kind of 2 reasons. The first is that there might not be enough civilian firearms for them to mount an effective resistance. Russia is not like Ukraine. Ukraine is a free people, and you can usually trust free people with arms. And when Russia invaded Ukraine, they were giving out AKs left and right. There are people Googling how to use an AK, right? They don't even know how to load this thing. But Ukraine trusted a free people enough to give them weapons and say, go fight. And you haven't really seen this in Russia. And I can think that, number one, there might not be enough civilian firearms to mount an effective resistance. Number two, there might not be enough young men to mount an effective resistance. The third option is that Russia might be reluctant to just park a truck in Kursk and give out weapons because they would prefer their people to be licensed and know everyone who has a gun, right? And they don't want to necessarily give out guns because they don't trust their people. And the fourth reason might be that maybe to some Russians, politics is something that happens to them, not something they actually participate in as a people. And if you're just going from day to day trying to survive, then it becomes really, really difficult to want to shoot at the Ukrainians who come into your neighborhood and bring you food to make sure that you're okay, which we've seen happen. So it could be a combination of all four of those things, but especially the part where Ukraine has treated people inside these captured territories pretty darn well. And normally insurgencies happen when you don't treat the population well. And so I think that is definitely a show of professionalism among the Ukrainian Armed Forces, that when they've rolled into these neighborhoods, you haven't seen them looting, you haven't seen them taking washing machines, and they're handing out food to babushkas who need it.
So there was even a joke about washing machines, that Ukrainian army did not take it, and that's why they had such opportunity to move so fast, because they did not take washing machines from those people in Kursk region. And it's really interesting that some people, we have seen some footage, some people were welcoming Ukrainian armed forces and even were happy about this incursion because of the hate and the hate of Vladimir Putin. What could it say us about this operation, and do you feel that it could be a sign of Putin's ratings going down?
I'm not sure if it could mean that the public opinion has gone down, because as horrible as it is to say, those people don't matter, right? The people who matter are in Moscow and St. Petersburg. So if those particular residents of Kursk Oblast are happy that the Ukrainians are there, because at least there might be some stability in the region, and they might not have to worry about having their sons conscripted into the Russian army. I mean, that's great, but at the end of the day, the people who really matter are the elites in St. Petersburg and Moscow, who have not seen the effects of this war personally.
Do you feel that they could change their mind, those elites in Moscow and St. Petersburg? Do you feel that they are seeing that all things, they are not going well, nor they are not going according to any plan, maybe only according to Ukrainian plan? Yeah.
That their minds could change if it stops going well for them. And don't forget, when you look at a country like Vietnam, when the United States kind of pulled out of Vietnam in 1973, the South Vietnamese government kind of went along for a couple more years, 2 more years before the government entirely collapsed. And if you are an elite in South Vietnam and there are some border areas that are getting taken over, you might not necessarily be that concerned, because that's so far away from you. So until the elites in Moscow and St. Petersburg feel this personally, they might not feel very connected to this particular event.
And my last question would be about what are your top 5 myths and disinformations about the war in Ukraine? What are the top 5 most misleading and disinformational pieces of news you have ever seen about the war in Ukraine? Maybe also about what are the Russia's disinformation one?
Oh boy, top 5. There's so many. Probably the biggest piece of misinformation that keeps getting passed around is harvesting organs, that Ukraine is harvesting organs from prisoners on the battlefield or dying Ukrainian soldiers. Harvesting an organ takes an enormous amount of medical effort. You need to have an anesthesiologist there who keeps the patient alive. And it's tough to do even in a hospital under controlled conditions. So probably number 1 would be the harvesting of organs from wounded soldiers or even wounded civilians or the dead. You can't really harvest an organ from a dead body either. The blood needs to be flowing. It needs to have oxygen in it. Probably the second biggest piece of information or of misinformation is that Russia is going to use nuclear weapons in Ukraine if Ukraine crosses this line or crosses that line or crosses whatever line. That's a pretty darn big piece of misinformation right there. I think the third is that Ukraine morale is low. I'm sure morale is low in some pockets, but we are talking about a people that filled up Molotov cocktails and put them at bus stations. This is a people who are never going to accept Russian rule. They do not want to be slaves. And when you have a people who are filling Molotov cocktails and keeping boxes of these things at bus stations to throw at Russian tanks if Russian tanks enter Kyiv, that is a totally different mentality. And that's not a mentality that we saw in Russia. Nobody's filling up Molotov cocktails to throw at the Ukrainians. Probably if there's a fourth item, that fourth item might be that President Zelenskyy is corrupt. There's corruption in Ukraine, and there's corruption in America as well, you know. But the one story that constantly gets passed around is look at all of Zelenskyy's mansions, look at all of his yachts, look, his wife just bought a $4.5 million car. The corruption levels of Ukraine are taken to an extreme by Russian propaganda. And probably the fifth most dangerous piece of disinformation that's issued by Russia is that if NATO gets involved, there will be World War III. And the truth is that Russia wants to force Westerners to think that there could be World War III that could involve NATO and Russia. And the fact is that Russia does not want NATO to become involved in this conflict, because the second NATO does, this operation will be over in 6 weeks. It will look like what we saw during the fall of Iraq, where we pushed in and that government toppled within 6 weeks. Russia is yet to fight against a modern army with significant air power. Ukraine's army is pretty darn modern, but they don't have the air power to kind of back it up. And Russia would be on the ropes within days once they came under that level of sustained 24-hour constant air attack. That would be a big problem for them. So that would probably be the fifth one, is this myth that there's going to be some kind of tripwire that NATO gets involved and all of a sudden there's a nuclear war that destroys the world. Russia does not want NATO to get involved because they will be defeated.
Thank you, Ryan, for taking part in our interview, for your time, and glory to Ukraine.
Well, thank you so much. It was great to be here.